This is Rari. I hope I'm saying it right. Rari. I know that Laurel helped me pronounce the name like 10 times. Laurel Brunke, who's actually part of the FDSA community, has this lovely dog here that has a history of guarding the food bowl and also items in his crate or around his crate. So here's a little before video that shows some of his behavior. Now I want you to watch this and look at the subtleties. I talked about subtleties in behavior in the last webinar. Weight shifts. So if you see subtle weight shifts or repositioning, just because the dog's not growling, snarling, barking, lunging, freezing, you might see these subtle weight shifts, and that's going to be your indicator to say, oh, I better watch myself because if I do get closer, I could get bitten. Or, you can start to escalate up the scale. So if you pay attention to the subtleties, you're gonna keep things lukewarm rather than them boiling over. There's a lot of weight shift to the right there. So the weight shift again as Laurel's husband walks by. And so Laurel was, this was before video. This is something she had started working on before I did remote consults with her. And just on a side note too, this is all done remotely. So to talk up doing remote consultations in aggression cases, I recommend it to you guys that if you guys are trainers or that work with aggression, definitely look into remote consults. They're great for a lot of cases. They're not appropriate for every case, but for resource guarding cases and things like this, especially if you have somebody that's a savvy trainer like Laurel, it's going to be very straightforward. So that's all we did in this case. It's just all remote and by email. I've never physically met Rari, but I certainly would love to at some point. But you can do lots with remote consultations. So this is all done remotely. And this is a little before video of what Laurel was working with on her own. You can see her dropping treats in the food bowl, kind of on the right track, but she wasn't seeing the nice CER that we're looking for, which is for him to leave the food bowl in a happy way and for her to safely be able to pick it up. That was kind of another thing she was having problems with, is trying to get the food bowl up even after it was empty. This is just showing a little of the crate behavior, just so you can see some of his guarding.
Let's go. Let's go. Let's go upstairs. Come on, upstairs. Upstairs.
So you see he's very hesitant about the crate, and he gives a little air snap there for her reaching towards the crate. All right, so this is kind of the initial sessions with him. She's tossing some food towards him, and you'll see some start of him looking up out of the bowl. So we made a couple criteria changes. we started with tossing treats rather than dropping them in the food bowl because we want to create distance. That would also start to artificially have him move away from the food ball. So in a sense, it's a little bit alluring to get the ball rolling in the beginning stages. Now, Rory eats raw food to give you a little bit more information about the case. So we were going along experimenting with different higher value reinforcers, and you're seeing some small steps here in the right direction. He's leaving the food bowl. There are some cases where the dogs could care less about what's being tossed around the food bowl, or are so ingrained, even if it's a lower value item in the food bowl, that they won't leave the food bowl because it's such a well-rehearsed behavior. So you can see some very nice initial steps here. But one of the things we had to play around was, as I mentioned before, value. What's valuable to the dog? So that's something we would continue to brainstorm here. Here is another session. This is probably about a week or two in later. And now Laurel's cueing his name.
Oops, sorry, buddy. There you go. Attaboy. Yeah.
All right, so it's kind of similar to the previous video. He's starting to move away from his food bowl. Here is another session. And there Laurel does a nice job of safely getting the food ball away because she tosses the reinforcers away from the food ball, a couple extras there to get him to move away, and that's allowing her to safely pick up the food ball. And we also add in that sort of operant aspect of her cueing his name so it would help him to start looking up out of the food bowl. Here is the next session. And so we've got her now spooning food, raw food, onto this yoga mat. I love that very clean way of doing it, keeping your floors clean way of doing it. Just keep a little side note that on that with anything you're adding into the sort of stimulus package, such as yoga mats or food bowls you're feeding out of, or spoons and things like that. You do want to vary those aspects up from time to time so the dog doesn't, again, so you don't, that blocking aspect that I was talking about earlier doesn't happen, or that new item becomes guarded. So just be sure you're aware of those factors that can come into play in some rare cases. Now we're seeing a little bit nice CR with the tail wagging there. We're starting to see a little bit more interest in what Laurel has. And she's doing a lovely job of actually marking the behavior now with the clicker. or he's got some good foundational skills and a lot of different things. Being an FDSA dog, clicker trained, and a bunch of other things he's good at. So.
Continue. Eat that. You need to eat that, buddy.
It's a nice little ball touch there. So we're decreasing distance, increasing intensity, continuing to get more of the emotional response we're looking for. Let's see, this is 5 or 6 weeks in, I believe. I didn't mark the dates on this, but... No weight shifts when the husband goes by. Feeding into the food bowl again now. Now we've got the CERs at a greater distance, we can start to decrease distance again. Lovely job there. A little bit more work here. So we're adding in some cold trials where Laurel doesn't have any food, so we can start to test to see if he still has the conditioned emotional response with no food around.
There you go. Hi.
And finally, so one thing I had Laurel do is just make sure she wasn't always holding the container, because that can again become part of the blocking effect I talked about earlier, where it only happens when you're holding the food container. So she's got the food container on the table, and you'll see her do a nice couple cold trials. And if I didn't explain that earlier, cold trials simply just says it's a way of you're checking to see if the dog you're still getting the CER without any food or anything else necessarily being in terms of a training context. So you haven't warmed the dog up, you haven't done any training in that session. You just kind of approach and see if you're still getting that CER regardless of what's going on in the environment. So a nice little look up out of the food bowl.
Good boy, yeah. Good job. Very good. Very good job. Very, very, very good.
So special thanks to Laurel for sending me that nice series of videos. Again, we did one remote consult. We met actually only once by remote meeting, and then everything else has been done by email, and then all these wonderful videos she's sending me for updates. And you can see such a nice progression between weeks 1 and week 8. In a dog that was kind of getting stuck with a certain approach of just trying to approach the food ball, but a couple of tweaks is sometimes all it takes in these resource guarding cases to really see some progression in the process. So, all right, next up is Lily. This is another trainer in my area, Donna, who's gracious enough to send me some of her work with Lily here. Very similar to Rory in that guarding the food ball, this dog. So you can see some nice work being done here, some nice conditioned responses happening. The X-Pen was for initial safety, but now they've progressed to the door being open.
Do you see that time she looked up and started coming to you before you even said Lily?
That's good. That's an improvement.
So that was some of just the very initial work there. And you can see how fast this dog is starting to shift. Now, if you eagle-eyed observers would have looked and seen the subtle freeze at one point, which is, you're going to see that sometimes during this initial work. You haven't shifted the CER quite where you want it to, but this dog's doing great and really understanding the process. But just keep that in mind. This initial work, you'll see sometimes, just like Riley, the golden retriever, where we saw some of the previous undesirable behavior there. So you just make subtle adjustments in your behavior plan to, again, reduce the frequency of those undesirable behaviors. Here's a little more work.
You excited?
Hey, Lily, what are you doing? Hey, you.
Lily!
Where are you? Lily? Hey, you.
Yeah, so when that bowl is full, she really
It's different.
has...
She has a different
Yeah.
mindset. Hey, Lily. Hey, you. Where are you?
So you can go ahead and toss one in there just for being present. Don't go closer. Yep, just kind of stay where you were.
Here. Oh, yes. No click.
So I wanted to show that video because it's a perfect example where things can kind of get a little stuck sometimes. And Donna does a great job of just throw the chicken anyways. It doesn't have to be contingent on the behavior when you're first starting out. You can go back to just straight classical conditioning where it's classical counter conditioning where chicken happens. She knows, Lily knows you're around. She can hear. She's just choosing not to look up at that moment. You haven't put that behavior on stimulus control yet. So you can absolutely throw chicken and mix and match the directions. And you can see also for a dog, we talked about the value of a particular resource. The bowl is full there. And so when it's full, it's just like when something's new to us, we just sat down to that full plate of dinner and it's very valuable to us at that moment. So sometimes you have to see some of that value decrease a little bit before you're going to get any response. And that's okay because you work up to it when it's fully high value because you've done practice with it. So you can see once you get the warm-up factor going here, then the dog's going to start doing the behaviors you're cueing. All right, so here's a little more work with Miss Lily.
Yes, good girl. Good girl. Oh, hi. Hi,
reward her for that.
Oh, I can?
Yeah, because she chose to disengage on her own. Yeah.
Good girl.
Some really nice coaching by Donna there, letting the client know that we don't need to ask for the behavior all the time. It's actually really nice when the dog does it on their own. So Lily's leaving the resource. That's absolutely a moment you can reinforce because it's a desirable behavior.
Yes, look at you. Good girl.
Now Donna's having the owner add in a little bit more intensity, walking by more quickly, stutter stepping, I guess is what you would call that one, but it's adding in different variations, different angles of approach.
Yeah, so do you see how like the shreds leaves all the
Yeah.
So if it's not totally cleaned up and you were to walk over there, she may find that something to worry over. Yeah.
Okay.
Excellent coaching there by Donna again.
Yes.
And this time when you go in and go to the other side.
Okay.
We're just going to do different angles.
Hey, Lily. Oh, smile. Makes that little noise sometimes.
All right, and here's one more. There's actually 2 more update videos on Lily.
Hello? Oh, good girl. Good girl.
So we're decreasing distance.
Hi, Lily. Good girl. Yeah, good job.
Are you getting her? Just the one that I'm seeing you throw?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. I wasn't sure.
Oh,
Oh,
there you go.
hey, Lily. Good girl. What a good girl. Good girl.
Yeah. Hey, Lil. Hi. How are you? Right in a bowl.
All right, and one more.
Hey, you. Good girl. Good dog. Good dog. Almost. I'll give you the whole cookie, right? Yeah, like that one.
That's right. She'll find it on her own. So just kind of walk over this way. Oh, yes. Good girl.
Good girl.
So yeah, there's a beautiful example of no cueing, and that, again, conditioned emotional response is happening. It's the dog is understanding when people approach, something good is going to happen. So that runs the gist of dog-to-human aggression resource guarding. So let's jump into, a lot of people had this as a request, dog-to-dog resource guarding in the home. And this I'm going to do in the context that this could be in a lot of this stuff I'm going to show you is for an intra-household dog-dog resource guarding, but this of course would apply to dogs guarding items from strange dogs. So the similarities for dog-to-dog and dog-to-human resource guarding, there's lots of them. We want to teach the dogs alternative responses when that stimulus approaches. So in this case, when the other dog approaches, what do you want that dog to do instead? What do you want the dog that's guarding to do instead? We want to change the association through classical counter conditioning, very similar to dog to human resource guarding. The difference is, of course, is that the dogs don't know to follow direction that well in terms of just leave your buddy alone while they're eating or while they have a bone or something. So we can't always expect them to do that. It's not like you're telling Uncle Bob to say, Uncle Bob, leave the dog alone while it's eating. That's easy to do. We can't always do that with dogs. So there are some differences. So there's this hall management thing. A lot of that's sometimes the solution for a lot of cases, but I want to go into actually a little deeper than just management. Management can work in a lot of cases, but there's some cases where you can't manage everything. You can't manage where everybody is, the guests coming over. And so we want to do some behavior modification in these cases. It doesn't have to be just keep the bones away or feed the dog separately. Does that stuff work? Absolutely. But we want to try to take it a step further in some cases because management always isn't a solution in those particular situations. So I've kind of broken it up into a few different levels, and you want to make sure you are applying what I'm going to show you in the context of whatever the client is capable of. There's going to have different levels of training, enthusiasm, and competency and ability to manage. So that's why that elementary school level is management. Some cases you might have to go in and say, this is what you need to do with the dogs, is just make sure you manage the resources well. Because that's all the client might be able to do, or that's all that their particular environment might allow for. So for a client with multiple dogs or multiple people in the family, lots of kids, it can get difficult to actually manage or do behavior modification in those cases to teach the dogs what to do instead in certain contexts if you have that many variables. So sometimes management is the solution. Then I go what I call the high school level, which is management, which all of the cases you want to do management, of course. Desensitization and counter conditioning, so changing the dog's association when another dog approaches and it has a resource. And then differential reinforcement of alternative behavior. So what do we want the dogs to do instead when a resource is presented in a particular context? So if the dogs are eating or getting them bones of their own, or it's before you go outside and there's those leashes being clipped on, all of those we can teach the dogs what to do instead in those contexts. I'll go more into that in a little bit. And then college level, I kind of call it, is just management. And then we add in differential reinforcement. But then we add in that whole thing I was talking about, autonomy, really teaching the dogs what to do if no one's there. And that requires a high level understanding and training. So I wouldn't expect a lot of clients to be able to do it to that level, but it can be done if they're training savvy, if they're willing to work on it. So the dogs start to learn that when you have a resource, all right, I can just leave you alone. And that's a big part of it, is just teaching dogs not to interrupt the other dog when a resource is presented. And I'll show you what that looks like in a minute. One concept to apply to these cases, so I find this particular concept very, very useful for intra-household cases with multiple dogs, is this whole concept of this 4 hours of separation. So what I do is tell clients, think of yourself as the center of a clock, and you have your other dogs next to you, and you're the person with the resource. So you might have treats or new toys, or you as the person is the resource and you're giving the dogs attention. You want to always have this 4 hours of separation as you're giving the dogs the resource. And the reason why is if the dogs are at 12 and 1 o'clock on that clock, dog A and dog B, they're too close and you can't often interrupt any interaction that might go south. So one dog quickly moving into the other dog's space, or kind of glancing in that direction, moving towards the other dog, or giving them that kind of evil eye that says, get away from my person or that resource. It's very difficult to do if the dogs are at 12 and 1. And that's where a lot of fights can happen. You know, the owner gets home from work and the dogs are excited to see the owner, and they're at 12 and 1, or jumping up on the owner and falling all over each other. That's where a lot of fights happen. So I make sure the clients understand this. Keep the dogs at least 4 hours of separation. That way, the client can easily intervene and just step in the middle of dog A or dog B, whichever dog tries to gain access to that resource in a undesirable way. So we talked about differential reinforcement of alternative behaviors, which can easily look like sitting. So when I get home from work, dog A, you sit. Dog B, you sit at 10 and 2 or 9 and 3. And if you do so, I will pay attention to, which is what you want. I will dole out the resource or the reinforcer that you're desiring in that moment if you give me that behavior. So the dogs learn what to do instead. So I will sit instead of going after the other dog. That's what we really want to teach the dogs in those contexts where it is there's a resource being presented by one person. So you can think about how that plays a role in so many other contexts. It could be when the humans get home from work. It could be while the human's on the couch and the dogs come over for attention. It could be when the human goes to the kitchen to give the dogs treats out of the treat cabinet. So many different contexts that could play a role. All right. Some other concepts here if we're going to go high school level, right? This one works really well for a lot of clients. I find most clients can handle this. So number one, you got to identify those hot spots and what the resources are, right? Quite simple. We identify what the dogs might potentially fight over, and then we identify potential hotspots or resources. This is where it can go south for clients because they say, oh, my dogs, I don't know why they're fighting. And then you get the history and you find out the dogs were fought because one dog was on the couch and the other dog approached. Dog on the couch leapt off the couch and attacked the other dog because they were guarding the owner in that space, or maybe guarding the couch. So you have identified a resource there. You have to help the clients be aware of other potential hotspots where there could be conflict, because you've identified one particular context. It can be very similar in other contexts. So you can say, okay, well, you know that happens there, so you also have to be careful when you're in your bedroom and one dog's on your bed next to you and you're petting it and the other dog approaches. That way the clients just get savvy at understanding other particular contexts in which conflicts can happen. So similarly, person gets home from work and the dog's all excited and then a fight breaks out. The same thing can happen at the back door. Dogs are all excited and you're letting them to go out to go to the bathroom, or you go to the front door to go for a walk or to drive them to the dog park, and they're all excited. It's very similar contexts as person getting home from work. So you want to help clients identify those hot spots. Once you know those hot spots, you teach the dogs alternative behavior in those contexts. So if it's the dogs that fought when the client got home from work, teach them both how to sit at 10 and 2 when you get home from work, so they can learn to give you that alternative behavior, but also teach them that in the hot spots. So before you guys go outside in the backyard, you can't be jumping all over and getting all frenzied. You got to both sit at 10 and 2. And then I'll open the door and each one of you can go out one at a time. So we're putting a very controlled but predictable scenario in that context. We add in desensitization and counter conditioning. So if I've got dog A on the couch with me and dog B approaches, I want to make sure I'm doing something to teach dog A on the couch that when dog B approaches, something good is going to happen for you. So if I'm doing setups with training, I might do it with safety at first. X-pen, me sitting in the X-pen with the dog, tethers, dog B is on a long line so it actually can't get to dog A, and vice versa. You can do safety setups, but I'm going to work in very controlled circumstances where I'm teaching whichever dog has the guarding issue that, hey, there comes dog B. That's good for you because it's going to pay off. Every time they approach, something really good happens. Or if they show up, oh, there comes dog B again. That means the treats come out, or whatever reinforcer you're using. So that's where the counter conditioning would come into play. And then I've got this thing called stationing. Got stationing. And I've got this little picture of this dog when I was down in Chile. He kind of taught his own station, but he lived, there's a lot of street dogs there, a lot of off-leash dogs. And so this dog would jump up on this, this wall is actually, this picture doesn't do it justice. It's probably about 8 feet high. And this dog would just perch up on the wall every time another dog would come by. He'd kind of set his own station. So instead of barking and lunging or chasing after the dogs that would go by, he would just hop up on his little station, watch them go by. And that was kind of his thing. So station just means go to a certain spot. It could be something visual like a mat or a dog bed or a raised platform, but it just says, or even an invisible spot that you point to. It says, go there, and that's where I want you to go, and it's going to pay off for you. You can teach dogs to start to do that on their own when a resource is presented, because the resource becomes the environmental cue to go to your station. And so I'll show you more of that in a second. And then, of course, you have to generalize all of this. because you're not always going to be there. High school level, though, you can get it where it's just clients control the resources well enough that they can, that they're present when that resource is presented, versus college level where you're not going to be there all the time. So here's just a very short example of management and then differential reinforcement. So the issue for these dogs is access to go upstairs. So in this client's home, the mom lives upstairs. They have like this shared apartment downstairs, this client's couple. And the dog always wanted to try to get upstairs first to go say hi to mom. So one of the major fights broke out right in front of this door. You can see it here. It leads to the upstairs. So all we do is teach them, instead of jumping all over each other, which is what happened, that caused the fight, we're going to teach them just sit, give me that alternative behavior, and then you get to go up one at a time.
Get with her, get her to sit. He can hang back here. That's fine.
So notice the nice 6 hours of separation there. Both dogs are opposite of each other. One dog goes up.
Keep going up and not dip. See what she's trying to do? So keep going up.
So he's able to intervene. The other dog goes up, and then this dog's allowed to go up.
Just to the halfway landing, and then we'll call back down. Hi, Wilson. Come on. Hi.
So real, very simple exercise. But in that particular context, if the dogs start to learn that new behavior, if I just hang out here, that's how I actually get access to the resource. Now let's talk about college level dog-to-dog resource guarding. This is where you start to, again, do the same things. You manage the resources while you're working on this. You identify what the dogs are potentially having conflicts over and the hot spots that they can occur. You still teach the alternative behavior, but you want the resource itself to become the environmental cue to move away from the other dog or to go to a station. Station helps to build that concept for the dog of, I can move away from this and go to my station when I see the other dog getting a bone or when I see the other dog getting attention. So you can easily teach that just by adding in that stationing. Go to your place, go to your mat, any of those typical cues where you teach a dog at first. And then you start to use the resource as the environmental cue. So you can do it just like many of us do with the difference between sit and a hand signal. So sit, hand signal, and then eventually the dog learns the hand signal, or vice versa. We do the hand signal, the cue sit, and then eventually the dog learns the cue sit. So you can do a lot of the same with cueing the dog to go to the mat, then presenting the resource, and then fading out the cue to go to your mat, and the resource becomes the cue to go to your station. Some cases, you actually have to teach the dogs communication, especially with older dogs. Some older dogs might lose some of those communication skills, or dogs that are coming from situations where they don't quite understand the cues from other dogs. They don't understand quite right what growling means, or the subtleties, the hard eye, the lip curls. Some of those things the other dog actually misses. So the dog that's got the resource is like, "Arr," and the other dog's like, "Oh, I don't know what that means. I'm just going to keep coming." And that's where fights happen. So you can also, if you get really, really into the training, you can teach dog B, the one that doesn't understand the cues of the other dog, to recognize those cues and move away when they see those things. So again, generalize and then cold trials, what we have to do with all of our resource guarding cases, but really important with dog-to-dog resource guarding if you're doing this concept, because you're not always going to be there. So this is, I'll show you, this is a little example. This is actually my dog, Izzy. She's we adopted her when she was about 13 weeks old. And the first thing she did when we brought her home was she charged across the room and latched onto my lab's ear and wouldn't let go. So this 13-week-old puppy showed this high level of dog aggression the instant we adopted her. She latched onto my dog's ear and wouldn't let go. And I'm like, what did we get ourselves into with this dog? But she also was a voracious resource guarder, so any kind of resources would be a problem for her. In my lab, she's getting kind of into her senior year. She's 14 now. kind of needed to relearn some of these social cues. So we did a lot of work with her on the resource guarding. That pretty much went away. But we wanted to continue with our lab to make sure that she still understood that if she's got a resource, there's no need for you to go over there. Just leave her alone, go to your station, or just move away. So here's a little showing that. I've got this little toy filled with treats that I'm presenting to Izzy in my lab. Crystal will see that and she'll go to her station. So we transfer to the cue becomes, when you see this toy, that's the cue to go to your station. It shouldn't have to be, I tell you to go to your station or go to your mat. It's when Izzy gets something, go do that and it'll pay off for you. Here's a little more of that in action. And you can do the same by reinforcing the dog for moving away voluntarily. So there's no specific location they need to go to. If you catch them moving away from the resource, reinforce that because that's a desirable behavior. You see Izzy get a resource and you move away, I like that and I'm going to pay you off for that. So here's that. All right, so that's how that concept works. It's not an easy one to teach a lot of clients, but for the savvy clients that can kind of understand the concept of stationing and reinforcing behaviors, catching them having, generalizing, doing all the things you want to do really well, that particular exercise can work really good for intra-household dog-dog aggression cases. So here's a final video showing that this is where it's really generalized for this particular client. Some of you guys might have seen this case. It's this Kismet and Maya, where Kismet is this dog you see in the picture here, and they have a history of fighting over resources. She's bitten Maya severely, twice sending her to the animal ER, so we've got the muzzle on for safety when they're together in these contexts. But you can see Kismet going to stations without anybody cueing it. All the environmental cue is Maya getting attention. So Maya's getting attention. Kismet's saying, let me just go over here and then go over there. So here's where you can see that it's been generalized really well by the client. So Maya's out and getting attention. Kismet goes to that spot. She's like, well, that's not working, and so she's gonna think again here. And so she goes to that mat. And I'm petting Maya and getting her excited and kind of riled up and giving her treats and things like that. So she's getting all kinds of resources. And Kismet says, well, let me try again. So you can see when a dog really learns how to move away from the other dog when they have a resource, you really take away that need to have competition over that particular resource, provided they are reinforced for doing so. All right, so that is Dog Resource Guarding Part 2. There's my contact information. Thank you guys for joining me. I look forward to seeing you guys in the Q&A coming up soon. So I will see you in a little bit. Thanks.